Chapter 8, Lesson 4 of a rate of change. Okay, first thing we're going to do is look at a definition of a rate of change. A rate of change is just a rate that describes how one quantity changes in relation to another quantity. Okay. Now, when we look at a graph and we're trying to find a rate of change, remember, we're not just looking for a constant rate of change. We'll get to that later. But just a general rate of change. When we look at a graph, we're going to measure the rise over the run, or the vertical change over the horizontal change. Right? And when we get a rate of change, we are always going to simplify that rate of change and write it as a fraction or a whole number. So if it does come out to be a whole number, we can write it as that. But otherwise, we're going to write it as a fraction. Even if it's a whole number, we usually put it over 1. When we look at a table, though, which is in our example, when we look at a table, we're going to measure the change in y over the change in x. So let's look at this example. So we just said we're going to measure the change in the y over the change in the x. So I'm going to say, okay, well, what's the change in the y? Well, it went from 288 to 480, so we're going to figure out what that change was. And then we're going to figure out what was the change in x. Well, it just went from 3 to 5, so 5 minus 3. So I'm going to do that on my calculator. So I'm going to subtract 488 minus 288. And I'm going to get 192 over 2. And again, we just said we're always going to simplify our fractions. So I'm going to simplify that, and I'm going to get 86 over 1. Now, when I look at that rate of change, is what that rate of change is telling me is that for every 86 steps, it will take 1 hour. It's kind of just giving me kind of the same thing as an average. Right? Now, when we talk about rates of change can either be positive, negative, or 0, no rate of change. So we're going to do our chart and we're going to fill in. We're going to do the first column for a positive rate of change. We're going to do the second column for a negative rate of change, and then 0 I'll do on the next page. So a positive rate of change, the real life meaning is that something is increasing. So a positive rate of change, it's going up. A negative rate of change, something is decreasing. All right, so we talk about as one thing goes up, another goes up in a positive rate of change, and a negative as something continues, then the other thing is going down. So if we looked at a graph or a picture, we might say, for example, okay, here's a positive rate of change if it's going up in this direction. Maybe we're looking at temperature compared to time. So as time progresses, the temperature is rising, it's increasing. That's a positive rate of change. Negative might be, okay, we have again time versus the temperature, and as our time progresses, the temperature is going down. Okay, we sometimes also have a 0 rate of change. And that means that there is no change. Something is just staying the same. So on a graph, it might look like this, right? So as the time progresses, the temperature would be staying the same. And as we find our rate of change and get a number, those rates of change are also going to be a positive number, which means a positive rate of change, negative number, or it might also be 0.